ever, I have to thank you in advance because we can't come back to this green room afterwards for me to do so properly. So thank you in advance.
Well, thank you, Anand and team, for running it with us. It's been a good one.
It's been fun.
Yeah.
Right, we are live, I believe. Welcome everyone to this event hosted jointly by UK and a Changing Europe and Ipsos. We're looking at a brand new survey that we've carried out together, a cross-national survey of satisfaction with democracy, attitudes towards politics, feelings of connections with politics. We will make the data available for anyone who wants to see it. For those who are new to these events, if you're on the Slido, you can put questions to our panelists on the Slido. To make my life easier, because I'm anticipating a lot of questions, you can also vote for the questions that you want me to pose to the panelists. We have a properly populist system here, where the more popular a question is, the more likely it is to get posed to the panelists. So please do that. Put your questions in the slot. We've got a wonderful panel. We've got Gideon Skinner from Ipsos, who is going to, in a minute, do a 5-10 minute presentation of the data to kick us off. Sara Hobolt, Professor of European Politics from the London School of Economics, a long-time friend of UK and a Changing Europe. Welcome back, Sara. And finally, William Galston, who is quickly becoming a favourite of UK and a Changing Europe because he's speaking at events quite regularly for us now. Bill, it's fantastic to have you back. Thank you for joining us, and looking forward to a very interesting conversation. So without further ado, Gideon, if you want to share your screen and kick us off with the presentation.
Thank you very much, Anand. Is this appearing for everybody?
It's appearing for me.
Excellent. Good. I really only want to talk to you, Anand, so who cares if anyone else
that works. Pretend no one else is watching.
So thank you very much. It's great that everyone is joining us, and I hope you're all interested in the results of this survey that we've carried out, and even more so in the conversation that we're about to have. I'm going to talk through a few highlights of some of the survey data. There is more in there, and Anand and the UK and a Changing Europe team have put together more detailed blogs, taking out some of those, going into the findings in more detail, which you can find on their website, including deep diving into some countries in particular, and also taking an overview. But I'm just going to run through what I think maybe is the three-part problem facing democracy from this survey, which is the proportion of people who feel unrepresented, who feel uncared for, and who feel unhappy. And I'll just take a few highlights from that in these slides. So if I can move on. Okay, so by our count, prepared to be corrected, but we think if you include all the EU elections, there's 80 odd countries who are holding major elections this year. Our survey was carried out in 7 of them. Over 10,000 interviews we carried out across those 7 countries using our random probability online knowledge panel. So hopefully the results are reasonably robust. And as I said, I'm just going to take you through some of the key findings that came out. The first one is the proportion of people who feel unrepresented by a party in terms of the challenges facing democracy in some of these countries. So we asked whether people felt their views and priorities were represented by various parties. We made a bit of a judgment call about which party was made a major, we classified as a major party. Broadly, they were parties that had large numbers of seats in the legislatures or had been in power over the last 15 years. We had to say over the last 15 years because that was one of the few ways we could justify having Labour in there as a major party for the UK. And we find that, in most countries, most people do feel like their views are represented, particularly high in Sweden, particularly low in Croatia. But generally across the piece, there's a reasonably substantial minority, that's sort of around 3 in 10, 4 in 10, again, less so in Sweden, even more so in Croatia who feel that none of these major parties are representing their views. These people tend to be younger. They tend to have lower levels of education. There's not a clear gender split. In a handful of the countries, they tend to be more likely to be women, but that's not a consistent pattern. And there isn't really a consistent pattern by politics either. When we ask people to place themselves on the political spectrum, the group of people who feel unrepresented, there's not obviously more left, middle, or centrist or right. Actually, if anything, they're most likely to just not put themselves on the political spectrum at all, and say they don't really know where they are. So there's this first issue, this sort of size of the group of people who feel unrepresented in many countries. But there's also clearly an issue on delivery. Do you think that national government is doing a good or a bad job delivering outcomes for you personally? And again, maybe a bit better in Poland, but otherwise 1 in 5 or fewer across these countries feel that national government is doing a good job delivering for them personally, and around about half or more feel that they're doing a bad job in terms of getting the outcomes that we want. So it's partly an issue of lack of representation, lack of voice, but it's also just on the pragmatics. People just don't think that governments are delivering for them. And all of this is feeding through into a level of unhappiness with democracy. Are you satisfied or dissatisfied with the way that democracy is working in your country? Always on this situation, we have Sweden as a shining example for us all. When we do any sort of multi-country research, and people are much happier in Sweden than in any of the other countries. But otherwise, around about a third, 3 in 10, 2 in 10, only satisfied with the way that democracy is working, and around about half or more tend to be unhappy. So real dissatisfaction with the way that democracy is working clearly in most of those countries. And it's particularly acute, particularly low amongst people who don't feel represented by one of these major parties. That difference, that analysis that I showed you before. These blue figures are people who feel that they do feel represented by a party. Again, satisfaction with democracy isn't particularly brilliant in it for any of those, but you can see that it is low, much lower amongst those who do not feel represented by a major party, particularly low in the UK there. And actually, even in Sweden, even in a country that had relatively high levels of satisfaction with democracy, the minority of people who are unhappy, the minority of people who do not feel represented by a party are still pretty unhappy. So even somewhere where generally things are looking good, you can still see this minority group who are particularly unhappy. It's probably worth pointing out that it's not all bad news, and people are not necessarily wanting to completely junk representative democracy. We've seen that in some analysis and surveys done by Pew. Representative democracy still gets more support than many other forms, even if it's falling. And we find that in our data as well. Only 37% are satisfied with democracy at a local level. That's not particularly brilliant, but at least it's higher than the proportion of people who are unhappy. Just over half of people still prefer a political leader who's prepared to compromise to build consensus. Around half of people are worried about the risks of giving their political leader, the country leader, more power rather than having to worry about checks and balances. And most people on average across these 7 countries still feel they can influence things through voting in elections. So, there's still some support for the underlying norms of representative democracy, despite these levels of unhappiness, these sort of levels of feeling uncared for and lack of delivery. But nevertheless, there is this kind of desire to change things. Only a minority of people across the countries feel that we can improve things through more measured reform, that it's too risky to make radical changes. In fact, most people in most of the countries think that it's radical change that's needed. And even again, in the case of Sweden, the balance of opinion is more in favor of radical change rather than measured reform. And again, if we look at the differences between the represented and the unrepresented group, we can see that the blue lines here are the people who feel represented, the red lines are the people who feel unrepresented. That particularly if you look at the proportion of people who are worried about the risks of radical change, so that's sort of the left-hand side of that chart, the people who feel unrepresented are maybe much less likely to feel they've got something to lose. Again, most people feel that we do need radical change. There's less difference there, but certainly the unrepresented are less worried about the risks of radical change. Although again, there's some interesting country findings there. I mean, France probably stands out where there's a really big difference on that question between those who are represented and unrepresented. And the unrepresented group, sort of just lastly, really drawing to an end, are also less likely to see the point of voting in the first place. So we can see there, around about 3 in 10, 4 in 10, so quite a large chunk of the unrepresented group think that there's no point in voting because it won't change anything, as opposed to the represented group who still feel like they can be invested in voting, invested in the process of democracy. And clearly what all of this does is lead to the risk of a vicious cycle, people feeling unrepresented, feeling that there's not many point taking part in the process, which we can see in just this figure of last chart for you, lack of trust in politicians, which we know is a problem for everybody. We know has been a problem for a long time and is even a problem for the countries such as Sweden, where generally things are a bit happier. Even in Sweden, the proportion of people who feel represented still are more likely to say that they don't trust politicians very much, but it is particularly acute amongst the proportion of people who do not feel represented by a major party. Like seeing sort of their 3/4, 8 in 10, even 9 in 10, feeling amongst the unrepresented, feeling that they can't trust politicians to keep their promises. And which again, maybe just leads to finish off with a last interesting question there about which country you'd rather be. Would you rather be a country like the UK or the US, where where trust in politicians is low amongst everybody, or a country like, say, Sweden or France, where we can see real polarization between the represented and the unrepresented groups? So just finishing off, what does this all tell us? It clearly tells us that in this big year of elections, there are big questions facing democracy in terms of public opinion. Even if there's still support for many of the principles, there's lots of criticism about how it's delivering in practice. It's particularly acute amongst this unrepresented group, this substantial minority who are more disengaged and more open to radical change, and sort of the sense of polarization we get in some countries between the represented and unrepresented groups. But it's wider than just simply feeling you've got someone giving you a voice. There's widespread levels of lack of trust in politicians, widespread concerns about delivery of outcomes, and generally a feeling that a system is broken we find widespread across many of the countries that we survey in. Which is where I will finish, having talked for too long, and allow the rest of the panelists to comment. Thank you very much.
Finishing on a high note. Thank you very much indeed. I think I'm right in saying, I think it was Ipsos that found recently that trust in politicians was the lowest it had been since you started doing the question in the early 80s. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. In the UK, I mean, again, it's one of those ones that it's always been low, but it's dipped even lower in our most recent finding. That we don't find that doesn't happen in every country. Not every country is necessarily as cynical as the UK about politics and politicians. But yes, it's definitely an issue here.
I see our cynicism as part of our soft power, to be honest. But anyway, Sara and Bill, in a sense, I've got two questions for you. I want to start off by asking questions specifically about the survey. But actually, I want to then move on to sort of ground that survey in sort of broader reality. So, I mean, the first question, I suppose, is, do you have an immediate reaction to what you've seen in the survey? Does it sort of tally with your own understanding of politics in the areas you study? Is there anything you found striking or surprising about the data that Gideon presented? So, Sara, do you want to kick us off with your thoughts on the survey itself? And for the viewers as well, if you've got specific questions on the survey, get them into us now before I go completely off-piste.
I mean, it's very interesting. Thank you so much for sharing it. It's great to see comparative data on this. I guess the one, or sort of one 3-part question I would have. The one question is sort of, is this as alarm? Is this a worry? Is this alarming? Is this a problem? And I think just on the basis of survey data, and I say that as a survey researcher myself, I'm not sure we know, is it a vicious circle? Is it problematic for democracy? I think we'd have to kind of, and perhaps we can partly try and address that in the seminar, ask 3 questions. The one is there any kind of relationship between this dissatisfaction with democracy and trust and how people behave in politics? Because if people participate, if people don't vote for extreme or illiberal parties, do we really worry? Like, we can ask people about satisfaction with democracy, and it's a sort of expressive. I can be, oh, I think the government is annoying. You ask me, are you dissatisfied with democracy? I'll go, yeah, I'm dissatisfied. Do the politicians deliver? Oh, no, God, they don't. But I still go and vote. I still, so in other words, is this a kind of sign of a democracy that's not working? So the first question I would ask, what is the relationship between that and behaviors? And I guess that's some of what we're going to be seeing in this year of elections. Does it actually impact? Are we actually seeing a shift where people either are just tuning out or they're voting for extreme or liberal forces? That would be the worry for me, rather than this kind of expressive survey responses. The other thing, and I think you probably have the answer to that, you were indicating that briefly, is it really different from what it was before? Like, we know the Scandinavians are always happier. So, I mean, what I would be really interested are the trends rather than the kind of comparative. I'm Scandinavian. I don't think people are particularly happy, but apparently in surveys, they're always terribly happy with life. So that sort of surprises me. And so, what is this? How are these things changing over time? And then the final question is, when people say they don't feel represented, is that reflected in the actual party system, what's on offer by the parties? I was a bit surprised in this focus on major governing parties, which seems to be a very kind of US, UK-centric way of looking at it. For example, if I'm in Sweden, about a third of 24 of people vote for the Sweden Democrats. They're not in your survey. So maybe I don't feel represented by the people you list, but by another party. So I'm not surprised that you find that bigger gap in Sweden. So in other words, wouldn't we be interested in how it is people don't feel represented, the relationship between who they actually vote for and those survey responses? So those would be my kind of 3 challenges to how we interpret that kind of survey data.
Giddy, I'm going to pass over to Bill first and give you all the questions to answer at once, if that's okay. But if you can remember those 3 for the moment, and we will come back to them. Bill?
Yes, I would, as members of Congress usually say, associate myself with Sara's remarks, and and especially the one about the importance of trend data. I'm always skeptical about how much we can learn from a snapshot. But if there's clearly change over time in a single direction, that is meaningful. How meaningful depends on the linkages between the attitudes and the propensity to behave in certain ways, either constructively or destructively, in politics. And as we've seen in the United States, certain very negative attitudes towards government, as it now is, can produce extremely unfortunate and even violent results. So, we on my side of the pond are very much focused on the meaning of surveys such as the one you've just conducted and presented for the actual situation of our politics. Here is the point that occurred to me in a comparative context. From a theoretical point of view, people would feel purely represented in a direct democracy where they simply spoke for themselves. So if you were constructing a chart of perfect versus imperfect representation, direct democracy would be at the perfect end, unless people feel that they're doing a bad job of speaking for themselves, which many might. But I would have expected, sight unseen, that voters in multi-party parliamentary democratic systems, on balance, would feel more represented than people in countries like mine with only two major parties that have ever been in government. But by focusing on major parties, have you lopped off some meaningful results? If people were allowed to say that, well, no, they don't feel represented by the major parties, but they very strongly feel represented by parties who haven't been in government, whether it's the Sweden Democrats or the Lib Dems in the UK, or any number of parties in Italy, or you name it, how much of a difference would that make? Because if politics has an expressive function, which in part it does, then I would think having a party that's speaking your language with your tone of voice, even if it only gets 10% of the vote, would be a more satisfactory situation than the one we have here in the United States, where with very few variations, people outside the major parties don't feel that anybody is speaking for them.
Thanks, Bill. A little bit to go over there, Gideon, if that's okay, if you want to start addressing those.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I absolutely right that, of course, any one survey is only ever going to give us a partial picture of where everybody is. That was part of the focus, was I suppose we wanted to be part of the focus of this, and why we focused on sort of quote unquote the major parties. Was because we wanted to look at that difference between the views of representation where it has been expressed in government. I mean, that still does include some smaller parties in some country, like the Lib Dems have been
sure
we're in coalition.
And deeply regretted, as I understand.
Well, ask them that. I suppose that's kind of I think maybe the sort of the common point, which I absolutely agree with on this issue about the trend, and you're speaking to someone and a company who kind of wrote a report a few years ago that was all about this issue on trust and whether and sort of to some extent questioning this idea that trust is in kind of perpetual, every time we see trust is like, we see headlines from surveys saying trust is low and sort of this is a new crisis. And it wasn't clear actually when you go back and look at the data and you look at some of our trend data from things like Pew or value survey or other kind of long-term surveys. It's not clear that necessarily trust is always in crisis, and I absolutely agree with that we always have to we have to start a new trend somewhere. But if you look at some of the other questions, it is much more nuanced and sophisticated than that. The way that I always think about this and talk about it is as I don't know whether it works as a metaphor, but it's trust is not an acute issue, it's a chronic issue. If we were thinking about it in terms of sort of medical terms, it's not a new sudden issue. It's an ongoing chronic issue that has been around for many years, that has follow-on impacts. It also means that, for example, it's unlikely to have just one single cause. There are multiple causes going on, but also it has multiple knock-on effects. The slight danger from all of that is that we can sort of sometimes think that just because it's not necessarily a new headline grabbing change, that doesn't mean that actually the underlying issue under it is quite serious and something that we have to do something about. It just means it's actually going to be really incredibly difficult to deal with it because there's probably no simple answer to it. And the other thing is, I was just looking at some of the other data, and specifically, Pew did put something out about attitudes towards democracy. And I agree with Sara. I think it's absolutely right. There's a difference between kind of discontent with the way that the system is working for you, which tends to be kind of much more stark than if you look at people's views on whether, say, representative democracy is still a good way of running the country and running their country. And there, people tend to be much more positive about democracy being a good way of running the country rather than they are about whether it's actually working well at the moment. But even there, I think in the survey that Pew did last year, we saw that although representative democracy still, I can't remember, 7 in 10, 8 in 10 people were still in favour of it across the countries that they did it. The sort of the intensity of that support had still slipped from the last time that they had done it. So there is still reason to be concerned about some of these issues, I think.
Okay, do either of you two want to come back on any of what Gideon just said quickly before we sort of broaden out a bit?
From the American perspective, on snapshots versus trends, I strongly suspect I'm the oldest person on this panel, which means that I can remember a time in the mid and late 1960s when more than 7 in 10 Americans said that they trusted the national government to do what was right all or most of the time. Within 10 years, between 1965 and 1975, that 75% figure fell to 25%. So we had a step functional state change, in the United States from a high public trust society to a low public trust society. And we have been a low public trust society ever since. And so that's the sort of thing that most people under the age of, matter of fact, all people under the age of 50, unless they're professional students of public opinion, would not know. And they would assume that it's somehow written in tablets of stone, in letters of jade, that government always, at the national level, always enjoys a low level of public trust. That is not so. And the fact that it hasn't always been this way enables us to ask questions that, if we thought it had already been this way, wouldn't even occur to us.
That's a very, very good point. I mean, on the one hand, I take the point that, we've bounced along the bottom with relatively low levels of trust for quite a period of time now. But in a sense, what we've seen, I suppose, particularly in the UK and the US, is that these low levels of trust, in a way, are like kindling, aren't they? And they're waiting for a spark. And, the sparks arrived in 2016. That whilst we might say, well, look, trust is always quite low, it's quite an unstable situation, isn't it? Because the right sort of combination of events can turn that into political outcomes that some of us might not like. So it is potentially dangerous, at least, isn't it, to have the sort of findings that we get from this Ipsos thing. I mean, however used to it we're getting, it adds to a sense of uncertainty and instability.
I think with public trust, I mean, it's not that straightforward. We would necessarily want citizens to just blindly trust politicians. I mean, in a sense, part of what is citizens' role, I mean, you could have a kind of, we as political scientists have one model, which is that citizens are very distrustful of politicians, and that's why they throw them out every 4 years when they're not happy. So, and that's why I'm sort of saying partly, what are the kind of behavioral consequences of these things? Is it just that right now, in a number of countries, voters have rightly or wrongly looked at politicians and say, these guys don't deliver for me. I'm going to go and vote them out of office, throw out the rascals. And that's part of democracy, is that citizens, they only lend, they're representatives of us, and we should be a bit distrustful. So I think the idea that having a society where we just sort of think, oh, politicians are always going to do the right thing for us. Now, I think where it becomes worrying, and I'm not sure I know that on the basis of this data, is if you start seeing, well, this system where I can throw out the rascals and get someone new in, that I start thinking, no, actually, we need a completely different system, or we need to vote people in that destroy the kind of the fundamental norms of liberal democracy, that doesn't work for me anymore. That is more what would start worrying me than the fact that we are a bit distrustful of politicians, because honestly, I think we probably should be. I think that's our role as good democratic citizens, to not necessarily trust politicians to deliver for us. But maybe that's a cynical view, but I think that's also in line with with the thinking of democracy working that way.
But there's a difference, Sara, isn't there? Sorry, Bill, but there's a difference, isn't there, between, for instance, thinking this government isn't delivering for me, so I'm going to boot them out of the next election, and thinking politicians are simply venal and in it for themselves, and so no one will deliver for me. I mean, the second one is qualitatively different, isn't it, and more dangerous.
No, I fully agree with that. I'm just saying, oh, I don't feel represented by a major party. I'm not sure whether that captures the first or the latter of those two.
Yeah. I guess, I would say, and indeed have written, that there is a hard to locate, but, easy to describe verbally, something that might be called an optimal level of mistrust, right? Where you want to be alert for government misconduct, but mistrust has to function as what the lawyers would call a rebuttable presumption. If government is actually performing, you have to be able to recognize that. And, there's a great deal of conversation in the United States now about the gap, for example, between many aspects of our economy, which seem to be doing rather well, and a very negative public view of that economy. And we can have a robust conversation about the actual state of the economy, but we may have reached a point where partisan affiliation, simply prevents people of one party from trusting what, leaders in the other party have done, even when they've done a reasonably good job. So I think that, I think there's evidence in the United States that mistrust has gone beyond reasonable and productive bonds for a democracy and is beginning to weaken the democracy. But
I think, Sara, if I could just bring you in, Sara, I know you've got data on something very similar in the UK in the aftermath of the Brexit referendum about attitudes from Leavers and Remainers about the state of the UK economy, which is absolutely, I don't know if you can remember it off the top of your head and you want to summarize it, but I thought it was absolutely fascinating.
No, I mean, it's similar to, what we know from the States, as Bill said. Of course, you have these just people, if you're a Democrat right now, you're going to think the economy is great potentially, and but certainly if you're a Republican, you're going to think it's bad, almost regardless of any evidence. And what we saw in Britain in the aftermath of the Brexit vote, partly because it was, so polarizing and people felt so strongly that certainly if you're a Remainer, everything was bad, and to an extent still in our recent surveys you see that, but also everything could be attributed to us leaving the European Union. And that's, again, it becomes then very difficult to have a debate, exactly as you were saying, in the US across that. You're not debating, what's actually happening, but through these kind of partisan or ideological lenses. And so then it's not so much a sort of healthy mistrust, but rather kind of you're on one camp or the other.
Now, Gideon, I don't want you to be a sort of presenter and then a spectator, so do feel free to chip in whenever you want. Okay.
No, I'm agreeing with everything that Sara and Bill have been saying about trust. Yes, there are. The point about America absolutely is, that you have to go. That's partly the bit about the change and the trend in trust. You have to go back to that sort of step change in the 60s and the early 70s when you really see the sort of the fall off, but otherwise it's been low for sort of decades since. And there are other countries, again, when we looked at this, initially this was probably sort of around the time of COVID, but there were countries such as Germany, for example, where you could see increasing levels of trust in politics. So it wasn't necessarily, it is all situational and impacted on by circumstances. And as Sara said, equally, you don't want blind trust, nor do you want blind trust either. You want some questioning. So I'm mostly at this stage nodding away and agreeing with everything that the others are saying so far.
You can also feel free to disagree aggressively.
I suppose it's sort of, maybe if I kind of pick up on the point around, so that how this makes it potentially dangerous. And I think I agree with you, Anand, that's part of how I think of it as turning it being a kind of a chronic condition, because it leaves you vulnerable to other issues, can leave you more vulnerable to other attacks on your democratic health. And in the broader work that we've done kind of globally on populism and on sort of feelings that this system is broken, it's absolutely right that so there are maybe three different prongs to it, and one of them is the public mood, and you need the public mood to sort of be receptive to more populist or radical new parties or insurgents. But that is only one part of it. You also need, first of all, you need those political entrepreneurs to exist. That you need to have those radical alternative parties or leaders emerging from the old structures to be there and to take advantage of the public mood and to sort of turn it into a sort of an effective desire for change that can be on a political level. And the other element, the third element, as well as the public mood and needing the political entrepreneur, is also to some extent you have to have the context, you have to have the reality out there that is encouraging people to want this change and to behave differently, whether that is an economic, that might be an economic crisis, it might be concerns about or actual changing immigration levels. There could be a range of other different things out there. So you need those three elements. You do need the public mood, which is primarily what we're talking about, but absolutely it's not the only aspect. You need the entrepreneur, and you need the wider context to be kind of favorable to radical change or a populist insurgency to help feed into it.
I'd probably add to that, you need a permissive institutional setting. So, I mean, in the UK, you need a referendum rather than a general election, which meant that all votes counted equally, and it gave that sort of feeling, an ability to express itself that is absent in our electoral system. But actually, there's a couple of issues that have come up in the questions. One of which is about the role of the great financial crisis, because you read a lot of the literature that comes across as something as a real turning point in terms of the relationship between the governors and the governed, and sort of economic performance subsequently, and the failure of governments to deliver. That this is something, a little bit more serious than what we were used to before. Do you think there's any sense of that these relationships have changed as a result of the great financial crisis and its aftermath?
I can speak to it a bit in a European context. I did some research on it. Certainly, we can see in Europe that it did lead to a rise of challenger parties, particularly on the radical right, but not exclusively, and particularly amongst people who were affected by the financial crisis. So there is evidence that perhaps in part because it led to a sort of dissatisfaction with the mainstream, and part, as Gideon was saying, this kind of underlying public mood. It did lead to what we called sort of the fleeing from the center, because I guess the sort of the dream they had sold, that this was, not only good for everyone, but also kind of stable and well functioning, didn't. And also I think there was a sort of feeling that who was going to be bailed out? Well, you can bail out the banks, but perhaps not other people in need. So there was a sort of a feeling of a kind of anti-establishment, anti-mainstream following that. But we did see it in terms of political choice in Europe, that did lead to a kind of a step change in the rise of challenger parties.
Yeah, I would say the same thing about the US, and at least chronologically, the connections are rather striking. So as you know, in the US, the financial crisis turned from a bad condition to an outright crisis in the fall of 2008. And the bailout of the banks towards the end of George W. Bush's administration and the election of Barack Obama represented a real kind of turning point, because within just months after Obama's assuming office, the Tea Party rebellion, which was the first real evidence of unrepresented dissatisfaction, principally on the right, erupted That in turn led to one of the most dramatic midterm elections in recent American history, where the Democrats lost 63 seats in the US, in the House of Representatives, and a strong Democratic majority in the House of Representatives was replaced by a pretty substantial Republican majority, which and but Obama's re-election in 2012, which probably would not have happened if the election had occurred 6 months earlier than it did. Obama was catching up all through 2012, had the effect of suppressing the effects of the rebellion at the national level, even though it was spreading at the grassroots level. And so when Trump came down his famous escalator, the kindling was strewn about the landscape and may already have started to burn. And then he poured gasoline on it and became a raging fire. And I'd say also that the decision, if it was a decision, to run the economy after the Great Recession at a moderate temperature, as opposed to trying to run a hot economy, did have the effect of allowing unemployment and slow wage increases to persist for many, many years. And discontent with current economic arrangements rose steadily during that period, and the bipartisan consensus on things like globalization and trade fell apart during that period. All of which is to say that, yes, I think there is evidence that the Great Recession turned out to be a turning point, triggering the rise of populism and increasing the sense that the two political parties, as they were then constituted and oriented, were not representing a whole bunch of people without college degrees and without the manufacturing jobs or rural employment that they used to have.
Well, firstly, thank you, Bill, for taking my metaphor and running with it. I'm very grateful about that. The other thing that's coming up quite a lot in the chat is, and I don't know whether people have data on this or can reflect on this, but whether or not there is an observable link between falling faith or trust in politics and electoral turnout. So, do we find that at times when trust is particularly low, that we get lower turnout at elections, or is there any kind of relationship at all?
If anything, it may be inverse. Trust was at a very low ebb in 2020, and we had the highest turnout in more than a century. So low trust can be associated with high passion, and high passion is strongly associated with high electoral turnout, at least in the United States. So the short answer to your question is no.
Sara, anything from your?
Well, I think here there's a difference at the sort of individual level and at the trend level. So Bill is right, at the trend level, I don't think generally we find a relationship. But of course, at the individual level, those people who say they don't trust politicians are also less likely to turn out. But partly, I don't know if that's a causal effect. Partly that's because, as Gideon said, they're more likely to be younger, they're more likely to be less educated, and these are all correlates of low turnout. So I would be careful about making that kind of direct link. And that was sort of my first reflection was, I think we need to understand better what are the sort of behavioral consequences of some of these, low trust, low satisfaction and turnout. But I don't think we find the trend relationship, as Bill said, in Europe either.
Gideon?
Yeah, I think all I was going to add, I'm broadly agreeing with that, and related to your earlier point, Anand, about referendums and the sort of the state of the the permissiveness of the system. But if we look at our data in terms of who was voting, for example, in the 2016 Brexit referendum in the UK, and look at the people who were voting in the Brexit referendum who had not voted in previous elections, which maybe is one of the issues why the polls weren't quite perfect in 2016. but we found in our data that the people who were the people who were turning out in the Brexit referendum, which had a reasonably high level of turnout, who hadn't voted before, were much more likely to be Leave voters.
Yeah.
And so there actually, again, if anything, you see, not to make assumptions necessarily about that group, but clearly the group there who were voting for change, who hadn't been engaged particularly, the group there who hadn't been engaged particularly in previous elections were voting for change.
Go on, Bill.
I was going to say in one sentence, that is exactly what happened in the United States later, 2016. A whole bunch of people who'd never voted before came into the electorate, and they all voted for the same guy.
Oh, interesting. I hadn't realized that. For reasons I won't bore you with, I was looking the other day at an Ipsos report from 2001, because I was just remembering the fact that in 2000, I mean, Labour lost something like 3 million voters between 1997 and 2001. And Ipsos did a report about why people abstained that was fascinating. And the finding was that people sort of made a firm decision to abstain. It wasn't, I can't be bothered. It was, I am going to make a decision to abstain because there's nothing here for me. There is nothing here for me to vote for. It's not that I can't be bothered. It's because I've made a decision. So I remember that was very, very interesting. Gideon, I've got a very unfair question to you here from Alan White that you might not be able to answer, but I'm going to pose it anyway because it'd be fun if you can't. Can you unpack the radical change element of the analysis? You remember when you were showing the slides about people who want, can you at least sort of, I mean, basically what I'm asking you to do is guess.
Yeah, so this is going to be speculation, because obviously the question we asked is as the question was. We have done, you can look at other data, and it was presented as a binary choice sort of on purpose. Many of those questions, we wanted to give people broadly a choice. Are you on the measured reform element, or are you on the radical reform? You can look at other data again. You can see Pew have asked a similar question about how much change people want to see. Or we've done work for Hansard Society over sort of many years over sort of how much people want to see the system change. And if you give people a bit more granularity maybe in their options, you won't get quite so many people going for the very most radical option. But nevertheless, I think even in that data, even again, for example, in the Pew data, you still get lots of people at least saying, I want major change, even if they don't want fully radical change. So you still got a lot of expression of sort of desire for wanting change. I think probably the key point here, which I don't have in the data and is related to what Sarah is saying, is how much of this is an expression of things are just not working and things are not delivering, which may well be related to kind of like the ongoing effects of the economic crisis and so on and so forth, and just sort of generally thinking how much of that's the interesting question. How much of it is people just saying, this is not working for me right now, and some of it is around some of those practical sort of economic or standards of living type issues, and how much of it is actually I want to kind of burn the place down, to use us, and that's, I know it's harder to tell.
I mean, and sometimes it can be down to specific circumstances, can't it? Because I remember the Hansard do this. The
audit, yeah.
That's it, the audit every year. I remember, was it 2019 where there was a majority of people who wanted to see a leader who was willing to break the rules, and that turned out to be very much a function of the particular parliamentary gridlock we had at the time. And a couple of years later, those numbers came down quite steeply. But Bill, in your book, which I'm going to plug for you now, this is Bill's book. You can all go out and buy it at any good bookstore. You talk about something similar in the US, which is to say some polling that found that quite a significant proportion of Americans just wanted someone who would get things done, even if it meant breaking the rules. Is that still a predominant feeling there?
Yes, it is. And, unlike perhaps in other countries, it was high the first time we tested it and has remained high, throughout subsequent annual surveys. And that I have always regarded as a troubling sign, because constitutional democracy is a form of democracy where the forms matter, and the forms are defined by law. And so if you have a very high percentage of the population that is so impatient about working through established forms, or believes that those forms are simply not delivering, that they're willing to overturn them in the name of the result, then that is in principle, I would say, a profound challenge to constitutional democracy as we know it. And as we've seen, that sentiment can have consequences if it is represented at the very highest levels of government. I wonder, Anand, will there be time for me to comment on this survey from an American point of view, just on a couple of points that I found striking?
We have 10 minutes. We have 10 minutes left, so you've got ages.
Well, I'm not going to take up 10 minutes, but 2 points struck me, especially forcefully in the comparative context. First of all, on questions about levels of satisfaction or dissatisfaction with democracy in one's country, and also in assessment of trends in democracy over the past 5 years, the United States is at the very bottom of the barrel. We have 50%, 57% of Americans expressing, either a fair amount of dissatisfaction with our democracy or a very large amount, and 70% saying that the state of democracy and condition of democracy in the United States has declined in the past 5 years. Now, I think both of those answers are perfectly defensible, but on the facts, but in a comparative context, the United States looks significantly worse than any other country in the survey. And if you had told me ex ante that dissatisfaction with the state of democracy in the United States would be measurably higher than in Croatia, I'm not sure that I would have believed it. But that is what your survey found. Second striking thing, your survey found that in the United States, and it wasn't clear to me that this was true to the same extent in any other country, it is the center that feels the least represented. Now, I think there's a very simple explanation for that, namely that there's been a great ideological sorting out of the two major political parties over the past generation, and we now have a left party and a right party. And whereas previously we had two parties of the center that overlapped very significantly, that overlap has disappeared. And so you have a bunch of people in the center who don't feel represented. But interestingly, efforts to organize them into a coherent bloc have utterly failed in the United States. An organization I helped start, but then left, No Labels, spent 2 years trying to organize a party of the center and come up with a ticket for it, and they failed. They had to admit that they had failed because no one stepped forward to pick up the mantle, of centrism, which in the American context means the mantle of bipartisanship as well. So there's a real paradox there between the apparent political opportunity that your poll diagnoses, and it's not the first, namely to represent better the unrepresented center, and what actual electoral results in the United States look like.
Now, Sara, I'm going to come to you. You don't have to answer this. It's just that you are my go-to expert on everything on the European continent, which I know is slightly unfair because there's a lot of countries there. But if just in case you had any reflections on, phenomena that you see in any European countries that sort of either contrast or compare with what Bill was saying there, that, are things changing in that kind of way in terms of views of democracy, views of the system? Because all we hear in the UK is how the far right's about to take over Europe. I mean, we like headlines like that in this country, but the reality is a lot more nuanced, isn't it?
I think there's some key differences, of course, with the US. I mean, the main thing is in the US, when you've seen the polarization that Bill described, of course, that's a polarization into two very clear camps. And I think some of that are institutional. Ultimately, there is a sorting into the parties, and when then the parties are captured by the extremes in the way that particularly the Republican Party is, you then get a more extreme party, and if it's very partisan, then people flock there. In Europe, of course, in most of Europe, what we have is just a multitude of parties, and what has happened, and I think which is in line with what Gideon shows with the public mood, is more people feel unrepresented, which has led to more fragmentation. So people, more likely to vote for challenger parties. It has also led to greater voter volatility. People are unhappy with the delivery of the people in power, so they switch more in every election. And of course, also finally, as you were pointing out, and then there has been a rise of the radical right, particularly since the financial crisis, and we now see the radical right, of course, in power or as the largest party in several countries, notably, of course, Italy is one. Another country, the Netherlands, which is a very fragmented party system where the radical right came top. Most recently in Portugal, that hasn't actually really had a radical right party since democratized, also now a stronger radical right party. So we are seeing it, and we could have a radical right-wing French president next time. I mean, that's, not an entirely unlikely possibility. So in that sense that we're seeing that, but it's really coupled with this greater volatility, this greater willingness to vote for challenges, which I think would be in line with, with the kind of public distrust and dissatisfaction that Gideon has presented.
Okay, thank you. That was interesting. There's quite a niche question that I think is, I was just thinking about it. I think it was fascinating, which is, I don't know if there's a satisfactory answer, which is saying, would it be true to say that the more people sort of distrust politics, the more people leave political parties, leaving those political parties more and more dominated by the extremes? And is that part of the reason for what we're seeing, that you see, that you can plausibly, I think, make that argument about leadership elections in our parties in the United Kingdom, that the smaller and less representative the membership get, the more likely they are to plump for a leader out of touch with the broader electorate. Now, is there any grain of truth to that? Do you think there's any sense of that in the United States, Bill, that parties get captured by a more militant but smaller membership?
It's an interesting methodological question whether the membership of the parties, either one of them, has actually gotten quote unquote smaller.
Right.
Because on the one hand, you have a larger share of the population calling itself independent. That's on the expressive level. On the behavioral level, and I'm sure this is familiar to you, most independents in the United States say that they lean to one party or the other. And the behavioral differences between people who say that they lean to the Democratic Party or the Republican Party and people who say they're Democrats or Republicans is rather small.
Right.
So have the parties gotten smaller? Not necessarily. They have gotten more uniform, however, and there's a bunch of social psychological research suggesting that as the scope of reasonable opinion within a group, gets narrower, that the group tends to intensify, because the only voices that you hear are voices that agree with what you're saying, and that kind of agreement then tends to shift towards the most extreme form of the consensus. So in that sense, yes, you're right, but for a reason other than the reason you suggested.
Gideon or Sara, do you want to come in on this?
Well, in Europe, we know that party membership has declined, and generally, I mean, it's a stable find that those people, not surprisingly, who are party members tend to be more extreme than the voters of that party. So I guess with even smaller, but there's a lot of difference in how much power those party members have. So of course the Conservative Party is a particular case where we have a very small group, but that have had considerable power because they could effectively decide who is the prime minister. But that's not always the case. Of course, also what you see is the rise of challenger parties without any party membership, like the Brexit Party, Reform UK. It's not really party membership. So there's a new type of party that doesn't really rely on members at all, but just have kind of more charismatic leaders or political entrepreneurs and perhaps donors, but not really members.
And to be fair, on the other side, if you look at like the SNP or even Corbyn's Labour Party, you have moments when you have a massive surge in membership in political parties and people feel enthused and come in their droves. Gideon, did you want to end. I mean, you might end up having the last word actually, because it's about to hit 6 o'clock. So you want to say
I mean,
something?
I need to say on that one. I mean, I think again the interesting bit. I don't know how much of it is new, but the work that you UK and Changing Europe have done to kind of compare the views of MPs and party members and their voters, and where they are similar and different, I think is quite striking on this. And I think it's, you look at something like the sort of the structures that we have at the moment. Clearly, there are occasions when the membership plays a big play in what's going on. Equally, you could probably look at Labour at the moment, and they are, they are focusing on the votes probably more than their party members right now.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable assumption, to be honest. So I think I've got a feeling I've chaired this really, really badly, because we've sort of got to the end without me realizing how quickly time was going. So to all those enormous, rather embarrassing number of people whose questions I haven't posed, I can but apologize. But I do hope you found this interesting anyway. I certainly have. So to Bill, Gideon and Sara, thank you ever so much for taking the time to do this. I hope you go and get yourselves a well-earned drink afterwards. If we'd been in real life, I would have bought it for you. I want you to be assured of that. Absolutely.
But Anand, I don't drink at lunch.
It's a very fair point. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us. Thank you to you three in particular.